Hey everyone, welcome back to Sneaky Panda. Today's adventure is a Gundam, but not your typical Gundam. I've always thought Gundams just look cool, but I've never really gotten into them or anything, just admired them from outside the hobby. But I stumbled across this file from RQ Mecha and figured I'd give it a shot. And in typical Sneaky Panda fashion, I decided to make it big. I started printing the skeleton of the mech in PET-G, and based on some rough ChatGPT measurements, he ended up being around, I think, 1/15 scale at about 4 feet tall. Since I upscaled it, the joints didn't fit quite right and were pretty floppy. They wouldn't hold a pose. That'll come into play later once I start working on the armor. Unfortunately, I lost the footage of me building the skeleton frame, but it was mostly just printing and assembly, nothing too crazy. Once I moved on to printing the armor, I switched to ABS. It's a little bit more finicky to print, but it sands so well that for me, it's worth it. Another unintended consequence of scaling up was that the armor to skeleton connection points were extremely tight, to the point where I had to get a little medieval with them to coax them together. I also love that you can make an acetone slurry with the ABS to fill gaps or use it as glue to bond two pieces together. I had to do that for several pieces since I was printing on my P1S printers, and at this scale, some parts didn't fit on the build plate in one piece. Once everything fit, I used the ABS acetone slurry as adhesive. It won't chemically bond to PET-G like it does to ABS, but it fills the voids so well, and it basically becomes part of the armor. It's not going anywhere. Next step, fill a primer. Between the beautiful sanding properties of ABS and the filler primer, there was basically zero layer lines left. However, that doesn't mean it was perfect. As anyone who has done a project like this knows, there is always sanding at almost every step along the way. As I mentioned, this was far from perfect. There were several areas with issues bigger than filler primer could handle. In most of those spots, I used some spot putty and even some epoxy clay in a couple of really bad areas. Once those cured, it was time for, you guessed it, more sanding. I don't mind sanding as much as most people do, but I really enjoy wet sanding, which is what I'm doing right here. I don't know what it is about it, but it just kind of scratches an itch for me. I love getting it super smooth. After everything was sanded smooth, I sprayed it down with alcohol to clean up dust and oils before painting it black. I prefer alcohol over water because it dries much faster and reduces the chance of moisture sitting in deep crevices. That way, I can move on to painting quicker. Before painting, I went over it with a tack cloth. This was my first time actually using one, and I was surprised to find that it was actually tacky, which, in retrospect, sounds really dumb, but yeah. I started working on the base color by painting it gloss black. I've done this before, and I always forget that I don't really need gloss at this stage, since I'll apply a gloss clear coat at the end. Matte or satin tend to be more forgiving. Once everything was assembled, I had to figure out a paint scheme. As I mentioned, I'm not super familiar with Gundam culture and lore, so I had no idea what a typical paint scheme would look like. After thinking about it, I decided to completely change things up and make it resemble a Formula 1 livery, specifically Lando Norris's livery from last year. Once the head was painted black, I started masking the design so it would resemble his helmet. I wiped it down first, then applied his logo to the side. I knew this would be one of the most iconic parts of the helmet, so I started there and worked around it with the signature squiggles he has on his helmet. After placing the logo, I masked off a line, similar to the one that he has on his actual helmet. Then I went to town, laying down the squiggles to mask those areas. I wasn't exactly sure which spray paint color would best match his helmet. After wandering the paint aisles at Lowe's, I decided on Rust-Oleum Key Lime. I think it was pretty close. You die-hard Lando fans can let me know what you think. I genuinely think someone could build an entire YouTube channel around unmasking paint. It's incredibly satisfying. However, it is also frustrating, because there's almost always a spot where the paint has bled under the tape. Next up was the visor. I started with chrome, then layered red and yellow over it. I could have gone out and bought an orange, but I already had these two colors, and I think it turned out okay. It was more of a tinted varnish than a solid spray paint, so it preserved the chrome look underneath. With the helmet done, it was onto the armor. I used Krylon Orange Popsicle for the papaya orange that McLaren is known for. I did a few coats and wet sanded between some of them to keep everything smooth. As I mentioned earlier, the joints didn't hold very well at this scale, which made it difficult to decide exactly how to paint the armor until I had it posed the way I wanted it. Because of that, I assembled him first and then painted him. In a perfect world, I would have painted the armor first and then assembled it. It's not the end of the world, but it definitely would have been easier. Like I said earlier, unmasking is both satisfying and frustrating. As I pulled off the tape, there were multiple areas where the orange had bled underneath. A little black touch-up paint cleaned those right up. That's actually one reason I started with black. It's much easier to cover leaked orange on black than the other way around. This is also why gloss isn't always ideal. You can see the difference between the touch-up paint and the original gloss finish. In some areas where it was really obvious, I ended up repainting the entire section black. With that, the painting was pretty much complete. The next step was adding sponsors and accent designs. Initially, I planned to use vinyl as masking and then paint over it, but I knew it would be really tricky, especially with the smaller logos. So I just decided to apply the vinyl and leave it. The crispness I achieved made it worth it. cut out all of the sponsors from last year's McLaren Formula 1 on some vinyl. I tried to mirror the actual car by making the major sponsors more prominent than the minor ones. I also cut geometric shapes and stripes from vinyl. I ended up trimming the stripes thinner than I originally planned and kind of freestyled the design as I went. I usually placed a sponsor logo first and then designed around it. Sometimes I'd place a logo or accent and then decided I wanted to change the orientation. Thankfully, repositioning them wasn't too difficult, and I was happier with the final result. Once all the decals were applied and the paint was touched up, I broke out the 2K clear coat and sealed everything up. And after that, it was finished. Thanks for sticking around this far. If you haven't yet, consider subscribing. And if you want to, go ahead and like this one. Thanks, see you next time.